No one stood when she entered. Not the judge, not the jury, not even the bailiff. And yet, the air shifted. At exactly 8:02 a.m., the doors to Courtroom 6 swung open with a groan so sharp it sliced through the stagnant tension like a blade. Arielle Monroe stepped inside, not as a guest, not as a lawyer, but as something this courtroom had never seen before, a storm in human form. She didn't hesitate. Her heels clicked across the cold marble like a countdown. 3 cameras turned to capture her entrance. No one smiled. One man scoffed. The judge didn't blink. She was wearing charcoal gray. Not because it was elegant, but because it made her look like armor. In her hand, a thick red-labeled folder. State v. Hallberg. Misappropriation of federal funds. $24.8 million unaccounted for. And only one person had dared to connect the dots. Her. But this wasn't just about money. This wasn't even just about power. This was about who gets to speak in rooms like this, and who gets silenced before the first word is ever spoken. Judge Preston Hale didn't greet her. He didn't nod. He didn't hide the smirk tightening at the edge of his lips. He simply tapped his gavel once, a bored rhythm, and said, "Let's try to keep this circus brief, Ms. Monroe." The courtroom chuckled, reporters scribbled, and behind her someone muttered, "She won't last 10 minutes. Arielle didn't respond. She didn't flinch, because she wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here to win applause. She was here to reveal a truth so ugly the system would have to choose, protect itself or burn with it. And in that moment, as she laid her file down on the prosecution bench, she caught the eye of a woman in the back row, elderly, quiet, dressed in a worn coat, gripping a purse as though it were the last thing in the world that belonged to her. Their eyes locked, and in that silent exchange, Arielle knew. If she failed today, it wouldn't just be the case that collapsed. It would be every single person who ever believed the law could still protect them. And yet, she straightened her shoulders, cleared her throat, opened the file, and then Judge Hale leaned forward and said one sentence. A sentence so cruel, so calculated, that it would turn this trial into a national reckoning. What did he say? And why did it make the cameras stop rolling for a full 6 seconds in stunned silence? That's where it begins. Judge Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. With one line, smooth, venomous, and dripping in condescension, he struck like a scalpel. "Let's not confuse ambition with competence, Ms. Monroe." The room went still, but the silence wasn't shocked. It was familiar. Like everyone in that courtroom had heard this tone before. Just never spoken so directly to someone who looked like her. Arielle Monroe was 34, first-generation attorney, graduated top of her class at Howard, magna cum laude, full ride. Public defender for 6 years, federal prosecutor for 3, survivor of 5 death threats, 2 failed indictments against police departments, and 1 relentless media campaign that tried to brand her as too emotional for federal law. She stood in that courtroom fully aware of the invisible scorecard already stacked against her. Because here's what no resume could fix. She was black. She was a woman. And she dared to confront a powerful white man in a room built by, and for, men like him. Richard Hallberg, the defendant, sat smug in his Armani suit. He barely looked at her. Instead, he whispered something to his lawyer and chuckled. The same lawyer who had lunch with Judge Hale every 3rd Thursday, according to courthouse gossip. The courtroom had never been a level playing field. But today, it felt more like a loaded weapon, aimed squarely at Arielle's credibility. Even the stenographer paused once, just for a second, when Arielle spoke. As if debating whether her words were worth recording. The bailiff? He offered water to the defense team, didn't even glance at Arielle. And then came the moment that shook her more than anything said aloud. An elderly black woman, seated in the gallery, was gently scolded by security. "Wrong seat," they told her. She nodded, apologizing softly, even as the white man next to her, legs spread wide, spilling into the aisle, remained untouched. It wasn't about seating, it was about message, and the message was clear. This room has already chosen who belongs. Arielle felt her stomach twist, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar ache. The ache of being seen as a disruption, not a defender. A trespasser in a world that only welcomes you when you're silent. But she wasn't here to be silent. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here because this courtroom, this judge, this defendant, had made one fatal mistake. They assumed she would play their game. What they didn't know was that Arielle never learned the rules. She rewrote them. Arielle stepped up to the podium with calm, deliberate poise. The red folder in her hand trembled only slightly, not from fear, but from the weight it carried. Inside, financial transfers, wire logs, 3 independent audits, all pointing to the same truth. Richard Hallberg had stolen from the public and gotten away with it for years. She began with a line she had rehearsed in front of a mirror 100 times. "Your Honor, this data." But before she could finish, Judge Hale raised a single hand, eyes still lowered to his desk. "Not this again," he muttered. A faint laugh echoed from the back row. Then another. The gallery rippled. Quiet. Cruel. Coordinated. He didn't look at the evidence. Didn't even pretend to care. Instead, he leaned back, fingers steepled, and said, "I don't have time for boring numbers, Ms. Monroe. We're here for substance, not spreadsheets." The room exhaled, not in shock, but in smug confirmation. This wasn't about evidence. This was about dismissing the woman brave enough to present it. The court reporter stopped typing. The security officer smirked. Even the defense attorney, a man who'd once called Arielle impressive at a bar association dinner, tapped his pen like he was keeping time to a joke only the powerful understood. Arielle stayed composed. Barely. But inside, something cracked. A sliver of fire rising in her chest, burning against the sheer absurdity of what was happening. She had the truth, she had the facts, and none of it mattered. Not in this room, not from her. She looked to the jury. 12 faces, 12 lowered eyes. No one met her gaze, no one nodded, no one even pretended to care. And that silence, that orchestrated, suffocating silence, screamed louder than any insult. "You are not welcome here. You never were." And then came the sentence that would later be quoted in articles, retweeted 1,000,000 times, and replayed in classrooms across the country. Judge Hale leaned forward, locked eyes with her, and said, "Are you planning to write a financial novel, Miss Monroe? Because this sounds more like fiction than law." The courtroom laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to remind her exactly where she stood. Not at the center of justice, but at the edge of a cliff, surrounded by people who hoped she'd jump. But Arielle didn't jump. She remembered something far more dangerous than fear. Arielle didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even move when the courtroom laughed. She just stood there, a single figure against the current, and said quietly, "Then I'll let the next piece of evidence speak for itself." No raise in tone, no theatrics, just a calm, cold warning, like the click before a gunshot. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a different file. Thicker, stamped 3 times. State Treasury, DOJ, and Federal Budget Office. One page slid onto the overhead projector, then another, then a third. The numbers glowed on the screen like a verdict waiting to be read. $12.5 million approved for the East Side redevelopment project. $24.8 million transferred. One signature, Preston R. Hale, approving the extra funds. The courtroom froze. The smirks died. The pen tapping stopped. And for the first time since the trial began, no one said a word. Judge Hale leaned forward, eyes narrowing. But Arielle wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking straight at him, because she didn't need to see the evidence again. She had memorized it. She had lived it. And now she was putting it right where no one could ignore it. The signature, she said evenly, was obtained under federal subpoena, verified by 3 independent analysts, and logged in the DOJ's secure server. Judge Hale's jaw tightened. He glanced at the screen, then back at her, then said in a voice dry as desert air, "Invalid." Arielle paused, just for a moment, just long enough for the whole courtroom to realize what they'd just heard. She raised an eyebrow. "Your Honor, you're calling a subpoenaed, federally authenticated document invalid, without reason?" The judge didn't answer. Instead, he slammed the gavel once, hard, and growled, "Document discarded. Move on." A gasp rose from the gallery. The camera crew adjusted focus. Even the clerk, who hadn't shown emotion all morning, looked up, because in that moment, something ancient and dangerous surfaced. Power wasn't just ignoring the truth, it was erasing it. Arielle stood there, still as stone. She didn't shout, didn't argue, because she understood something most people never get to see this clearly. This wasn't a legal proceeding anymore. It was a performance. And the man behind the bench, he wasn't a judge. He was the star actor in a system built to protect itself. And if this was theater, Arielle Monroe had just stolen the spotlight. The evidence was real. The signature was verified. The money was missing. But none of it mattered. "Invalid," he'd said. One word, tossed casually from the bench like crumbs to pigeons. And suddenly, justice didn't exist. The room didn't erupt. It adjusted. The defense attorney smiled. The stenographer resumed typing, but slower this time, as if she knew none of it would matter. The camera crew subtly shifted angles, away from the screen, toward the defendant, Richard Hallberg, who sat reclined, hands folded, eyes half-lidded in smug serenity. He knew. They all knew. This trial wasn't about whether he was guilty. It was about whether anyone dared to prove it. Arielle looked to the jury. Again, still no one met her eyes. Then it happened. The mic on the prosecution table let out a sharp burst of static, followed by a voice. Familiar, male, deep, and venomous. "Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger. Understood?" The room froze. Reporters stopped writing. The clerk's eyes went wide. A low ripple ran through the gallery like a dropped glass. Silent shock, spreading fast. It was his voice. Judge Preston Hale, caught on tape, ordering obstruction, denying access to a crucial piece of evidence, targeting her. And suddenly, this wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about power anymore. This was about survival. Arielle didn't flinch, didn't gloat. She simply leaned forward, pulled out a sealed transcript with a federal authentication stamp, and laid it on the desk. "This recording," she said evenly, "was obtained through a legally authorized wiretap, signed by the Inspector General, verified by 3 independent agencies." The judge's face turned white, then red, then cold. "This recording is illegal and inadmissible." His voice cracked. For the first time since the trial began, he looked shaken. But even now, even after being exposed, he held his position. held his robe, held the gavel, because that's what systems like this do. They pretend the truth doesn't exist until it gives up trying to be heard. No one objected, no one intervened. Not the bailiff, not the defense, not the court reporter. Every piece of that courtroom machinery stayed silent. And in that silence, Arielle understood. She wasn't standing in front of a judge. She was standing in front of a man who had no intention of letting the truth breathe. But what happens when the truth no longer asks permission? The courtroom wasn't quiet. It was paralyzed. That voice, his voice, still echoed off the walls, drenched in authority and corruption all at once. Arielle didn't wait. She reached down, unlocked her briefcase, and removed a second folder. This one thicker, heavier, with the federal seal burned into its cover. She placed it gently on the podium, then slid one final document onto the overhead projector, a seizure order. Signed by the State Inspector General, stamped by the Department of Justice, and attached to the ledger. The ledger, the internal financial record of Hallberg's real estate empire. The smoking gun, the one document Judge Hale had personally blocked. And now, projected in front of 3 cameras, 24 spectators, and one rapidly unraveling courtroom, it was no longer blocked. It was exposed. At the bottom of page 1, a signature clear, sharp, undeniable. Preston R. Hale authorized disbursement. Authorized back-channel transfers. Authorized everything Arielle had claimed. And more. The courtroom gasped. And this time, no one laughed. Judge Hale's face drained of color. He stood abruptly, gripping the desk with trembling fingers. His gavel slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor like a final confession. "This document," he said, voice hoarse, "is forged." But the room didn't believe him. Not anymore. One of the jurors leaned forward. A court officer swallowed hard, glancing at the exit. The gallery murmured, not in chaos, but in awakening, because for the first time, the illusion had cracked, and through it they saw not a judge, but a criminal. And then, the final blow. Arielle reached beneath the podium and pressed a button. The speaker crackled again. Same voice, same man, only now clearer, undeniable. "I don't care how. Just make sure she never touches the ledger." Got it. The words didn't just hang in the air. They exploded in it. And for a moment, one suspended, breathtaking moment, the courtroom became still enough to hear a gavel. If only it hadn't already fallen. People didn't shout. They didn't move. They watched. They watched him unravel. Judge Hale's eyes darted. To the jury, the clerk, the camera, the security. But no one would meet his gaze. Not anymore. Because the mask had fallen. The robe meant nothing. And the title? It was just ink on paper. What mattered now was the truth. And Arielle Monroe had just made it impossible to ignore. But exposure alone doesn't end injustice. Someone still had to carry it away. In handcuffs. No one said a word. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't erupt. Because this moment wasn't made for celebration. It was made for reckoning. The door creaked. 2 federal officers entered. Dark uniforms, cold eyes, no announcement needed. Their presence alone froze the air in place. Arielle didn't turn. She didn't have to. She kept her eyes on him. Judge Hale, still clinging to the bench like it could save him. Still dressed in the robe like it still meant something. Still trying to hold a mask that had already crumbled at his feet. The taller officer stepped forward, unfolded a sheet of paper, and read with absolute clarity. Preston R. Hale, under orders from the U.S. Attorney General's office, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial abuse of power, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. And just like that, The most powerful man in the room became the smallest. Gasps, hands over mouths, cameras clicking in a frenzy. This time, not as spectators, but as witnesses. The same people who had ignored Arielle, laughed at her, dismissed her, now couldn't look away. Because the truth wasn't a theory anymore. It had hands, it had cuffs, and it was walking straight toward power with no hesitation. Judge Hale tried to speak. No one listened. He looked around, pleading silently for an ally. A nod, a glance, a hand. But the courtroom he had once ruled over had turned its back. Even Hallberg, the defendant, the rich developer, the co-conspirator, leaned away as the officers approached, as if hoping guilt wasn't contagious. Click, click. The handcuffs snapped shut with a sound that rang louder than any gavel he had ever slammed. Arielle didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She stood motionless, like marble carved by every injustice she had ever faced, and now sharpened by this single act of accountability. As the judge was led past her, their eyes met for a final time. There was no hatred, no triumph, just silence. And in that silence, he understood. She hadn't come to destroy him. She had come to dismantle the idea that he was ever untouchable. And she had. The door slammed shut behind him. And with it, the illusion that had ruled this courtroom for years. But as the robe fell, another man's composure cracked, and Arielle turned to face him next. The courtroom was still. Judge Hale was gone. His gavel, his robe, his power, reduced to a headline and a pair of steel cuffs. But Arielle Monroe, she remained. Standing, breathing, enduring. Across the aisle, Richard Hallberg sat frozen. Once untouchable, now cornered. The arrogance was gone. So was the confidence. All that remained was sweat on his brow and silence in his mouth. Arielle walked toward him, slow, steady, unshaking. She placed a deposition form on the table. Beside it, another folder. Inside, evidence. Documents bearing his name next to Hale's. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Do you want to keep your life?" she asked. Hallberg blinked, twitched, then whispered, almost choking on the words, "I need protection." He wasn't confessing from guilt. He was confessing from fear. Arielle nodded once, then slid a pen across the table. "I want everyone involved," she said. "Every name, every deal, every judge, politician, and banker who sat at your table while the rest of the country starved for fairness." Hallberg hesitated, but not for long, because when the king falls, the pawns scramble. 1 week later, Washington, D.C., the House chamber was packed. No debates, no ceremonial applause, just a stillness. The kind that only arrives before a nation is asked to listen. Arielle Monroe stood at the podium. Black suit, no jewelry, no makeup, just fire. Behind her, the flag didn't feel symbolic. It felt accountable. She didn't have notes. She didn't need them. "We cannot call this a nation of justice," she said, voice unwavering, "if the robe itself becomes the tool of injustice." Every screen in the country flickered. Living rooms, dorms, phones in barbershops, tablets in waiting rooms. In a tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago, an 8-year-old girl stared at the screen, her eyes wide, unmoving. She didn't understand every word, but she understood that voice. She recognized that gaze. Next to her, her mother, a nurse just home from a night shift, lifted her head, blinking away exhaustion. A moment passed. Then the little girl whispered, "Mom, I want to be like her." And that was the moment justice reached farther than any courtroom ever could. Not with punishment, but with purpose. Not with anger, but with clarity. Because Arielle Monroe hadn't just exposed a corrupt judge. She had ignited a generation. If this story made you feel something, anger, pride, hope, then you already understand why these voices matter. This isn't just about courtroom victories. It's about the fire that burns in people who refuse to be silent. We tell these stories, not to relive injustice, but to remind you, justice only exists when we fight to build it together. Subscribe to KaYi, and never miss another story that dares to stand up, speak truth, and awaken the next generation. Because the next story might be yours.